This presentation is going to be about some trends and developments that have occurred in theater between the 20th century and the present. Three major developments in theater that I'd like to focus on are: 1, the emergence of a wide variety of experimental modes of theater making; 2, the blending of realistic and non-realistic modes of theater making; and 3, an increase of diversity in playwriting, directing, and other areas of theater. Experimental forms of theater began to emerge in the second half of the 20th century, and actually even before the second half, because we've talked about avant-garde theater. That trend continues and does continue to develop in the present. One of the first leaders of experimental forms of theater in the 20th century I'd like to mention is Vsevolod Meyerhold. And he is considered one of the primary minds behind constructivism and also the primary mind behind biomechanics in the theater. Biomechanics in particular was developed by Vsevolod Meyerhold between 1920 and 1921. It's a highly technical and physical approach to acting. And in biomechanics, the actors trained in gymnastics, circus movements, and ballet in order to make as efficient machines, in order to make their bodies efficient machines capable of carrying out an assignment received from the director. Their particular patterns of physical movement elicit particular emotions, and if an actor performs a kinetic pattern, it is desirable to elicit a corresponding emotional response within herself or within the spectators. Meyerhold, who actually worked with Stanislavski and was a student of Stanislavski's, was seeking to replace Stanislavski's emphasis on internal motivation with one on physical and emotional reflexes. For instance, to invoke a feeling of exuberant joy, Meyerhold believed it was more efficient for an actor to plummet down a giant slide, swing on a trapeze, or do a somersault than to emulate the behaviors of a realistic human being experiencing joy. Constructivism is a Russian art term from the early 1910s, and it was used to describe a style of sculpture composed of intersecting planes and masses without representational content, aka these were abstract sculptures that did not represent anything in particular in an obvious way. Constructivist theater is a form of theater in which Meyerhold used to describe constructivist is a term Meyerhold used to describe his approach to creating scenery. His scenery was designed to enable his actors to perform biomechanics with great dynamism and physical range. And Meyerhold's constructivist sets were often completely abstract, non-representational, as the one you see in this picture. And Meyerhold's constructivist sets often included non-representational platforms, ramps, turning wheels, trapezes, and other objects to create a machine for the stage that was more of a practical physical tool to be manipulated by the actors than a decorative scene or a representation of a specific place. German expressionism in theater occurs in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. The term expressionism first appeared in 1901 when a French art critic used this term to distinguish the kind of painting done by Van Gogh from that of impressionist painters who sought to capture the appearance of objects as seen under a certain light at a particular moment. Expressionism was described as painting that projected strong feelings into objects and portrayed these objects as modified by the painter's own vision. Around 1910, characteristics of expressionism in German literature and the arts were identified by German critics, and these characteristics were, generally speaking, that human emotions and attitudes were projected into inanimate objects. Truth was sought in humanity's spiritual qualities rather than external appearance. And opposed to realism and naturalism, expressionism is opposed to realism and naturalism on the grounds of opposition to the idea that surface details and physically observable things represent fundamental truth. And there was a principle in expressionism that external reality is alterable and should be changed to create harmony with humanity's spiritual nature. German expressionism in theater operated in similar ways to the way it operated in the visual arts. There were distorted lines, exaggerated shapes, abnormal colorings, mechanical movements, telegraphic speech. And telegraphic speech means speech that's very short, often broken mid-sentence. Often the world was presented as though seen through the view of the protagonist, whose interpretation of reality imposed drastic interpretations of otherwise mundane events. The sets often look strange in Expressionist theater because the sets represented the perception of the lead character and their inner spiritual or psychological state. The plays were structurally episodic, and unity in German Expressionist plays was derived from a central idea or argument. Expressionist plays often promised a future utopia. Lights, costumes, and sets can have a meaning that is symbolic of the protagonist's inner state or some other internally experienced emotion. Bertolt Brecht, one of the most influential theater theorists, and still very much a major influence on theater as it's developing today. And he came up with a concept called epic theater. Bertolt Brecht began his work as an avant-garde playwright experimenting with German Expressionism. His first highly successful play was Three Penny Opera, and that included music by Kurt Weill. And this production ran for 400 nights, which is an incredibly long run in this time period. In 1933, Brecht left Germany to flee the Nazis, and while he was in exile, he wrote some of his most famous works, many of which were not produced until he returned to Germany in 1947 after the end of World War II. Among these plays were Mother Courage and Her Children, Galileo, The Good Person of Szechuan, and The Caucasian Chalk Circle. Brecht is probably most famous today for his theater theories concerning epic theater. Some of the concepts in epic theater include the concept of epic itself, and the term epic refers to Brecht's mixture of epic, which means direct storytelling, and dramatic, which means role-playing and representation and narrative techniques in his theatrical work. Brecht wanted the audience... So when I say, before I move on, epic storytelling versus dramatic storytelling. In epic storytelling, somebody will tell you a story about someone else. They'll say, John walked down the street and John bought an apple. But in the dramatic storytelling mode, somebody portrays John. So rather than someone telling us what John is doing, we see someone who is John walk down the street and buy an apple. Brecht blends these two techniques in his theater. Epic meaning telling the story, dramatic meaning portraying the character in the story. Brecht wanted the audience to watch a play critically rather than passively. He was interested in developing the alienation effect, and this is a way of making the dramatic events on stage strange enough that the audience would ask questions about them. So in order to create alienation, Brecht would use the following techniques. He would make he made theatrical tools such as lighting equipment, musicians, scene changes visible to the audience. So the audience would see how the music and the light and all those things were made. He made these elements very, very simple, and he deliberately separated episodes of the story by inserting songs, captions, or narrative passages between them to break up the story. The purpose of epic theater, according to Brecht, was to help the audience relate what they saw in the theater to socioeconomic and political conditions outside of the theater. He hoped the audience would gain new insights and work to improve their own world as a result of seeing his plays. The epic theater was not a theater of unified effect. Brecht called unity in theater redundant. He believed each element of theater should make a different comment on the production, and he rejected entirely Stanislavski's psychological approach to acting. He urged actors to think of their roles in the third person, and he urged actors to use their acting to comment on their characters' motivations and actions. Alongside Brecht, perhaps the most influential theater theorist is Antonin Artaud. and he came up with the idea of what's called the theater of cruelty. Now, Artaud originally participated in the French Surrealism art movement, which ideally sought to create art from pure, unfettered, unconscious thought impulses. And the most famous Surrealist painter that most people know is Salvador Dali, and his most famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, depicts a group of melting clocks. In 1926, when he was still part of the Surrealist movement, Artaud founded the theater Alfred Jarry in Paris. And if you remember, Alfred Jarry from our avant-garde section is the playwright who wrote Ubu Roi. Artaud founded the theater Alfred Jarry in Paris, and he had been previously working with Lugnepo, who in Paris as well. So this theater was dedicated only to non-realistic theater, and it only lasted for 2 seasons. Artaud perceived problems with mainstream theater in Europe. He felt that it was devoted to a very narrow range of human experience, which was the psychological problems of individuals or the social problems of groups. Artaud wanted to see a theater dedicated to what he believed to be the more important aspects of human existence, things submerged in the subconscious. He wanted theater about things that caused division and hatred between people, leading to disaster and violence, because he wanted to help eradicate that from human behavior and culture. Artaud believed that the proper theatrical experience could help people lose ferocity and express a joy that society has forced them to suppress. He felt that theater can do this because it can enable humans to evacuate these dangerous tendencies in ways that are not destructive. So he would say that the theater has been created to drain abscesses collectively. So the cruelty of this is that poking of the human being in order to create that abscess and drain those bad things out of them. It's a theater to drain humans of their dangerous nature that leads to hatred, division, violence, and social disaster. The theater of cruelty, Artaud says, must bypass rational thought and operate directly upon the audience's senses, thereby breaking down their defenses. He called it the theater of cruelty because it is designed to force the audience to confront itself. The cruelty is not physical, it's moral and or psychological. Artaud's suggestions for producing the theater of cruelty would become very, very influential of theater in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and all the way into the present. The image you see here is from a 1970 production by the Performance Group in New York City, and they were very influenced by the theater of cruelty. So the substitutions of new myths for outmoded dramatic masterpieces. Artaud claimed that the old classics of the past are no longer applicable or understandable by contemporary audiences, and he wanted new myths that contemporary audiences could identify with. He wanted to replace traditional theater buildings with remodeled barns, factories, or airplane hangars. The performance in this photo you see here is actually set up in what was once a auto repair garage, and they've set up all the scaffolding in the space where both audience members and performers can stay and perform or watch a performance. He wanted to place the audience in the center of the action and locating action on the corners, acting overhead, acting along the walls. He called for a vibrating, shredded lighting effect. And for sound, Artaud wanted shrillness, abrupt changes in volume, the use of human voices to create harmonies and dissonances. This is another photo of the performance garage, and as you see, the mixture of audience and actors, it's hard to know who's the audience and who's the actor in these performances. You have to really look carefully to try to figure that out. The planned effect of theater of cruelty is it's an assault on the audience's physical senses with the machinery of scenery. It will purge the audience morally and spiritually, according to Artaud. So unlike most other theater artists, Artaud viewed theater as a means to the salvation of human beings, not via a thing of beauty, but as a tool, a kind of tool of artistic torment. Another of the most influential playwrights of the 20th century who has informed contemporary modes of theater is Samuel Beckett. he became an accidental representative of the theater of the absurd. And when I say that because the term theater of the absurd was created by a theorist named Martin Esslin in a book called The Theater of the Absurd, and he called Samuel Beckett a member of the theater of the absurd, but Beckett claimed that he actually didn't really necessarily embrace that label. Nevertheless, Beckett's dramaturgy, way of writing plays, became representative of theater of the absurd. So theater of the absurd uses scenery, dialogue, and action to display a world that has the following characteristics. In it, human beings are condemned to be free in a universe with no guiding divine principle. In it, people are entirely defined by what they do. People must create their own morals and standards. And in the theater of the absurd worlds, the humans face a huge gap between their hopes and the irrationality of a random universe. And finally, humans have to create their own order out of the chaos of the universe. So in order to create this kind of a world, Samuel Beckett used several techniques. He wrote plays as a series of episodes that were unified only by a theme or a mood. There was no cause to effect story arrangements in his plays. The dramatic structure of the play or the performance paralleled a seemingly chaotic, irrational dramatic world with not much in the way of logic running things. The sense of absurdity in theater of the absurd plays is heightened by a juxtaposition of seemingly unrelated events that produce serio-comic and ironic effects. And since language is an artificial tool rooted in rationalism, absurdist playwrights often demonstrated its inadequacy and supported it to nonverbal devices. And what this means is that characters in absurdist plays very rarely communicate with each other effectively. They talk at each other, but they don't necessarily ever reach understanding. And then sometimes they're reduced to strange physical actions to try to communicate. And this, again, is another photo from a Samuel Beckett play called Endgame. Probably the most representative theater of the absurd play is Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Excuse me. Waiting for Godot was listed by Martin Esslin in Theater of the Absurd as an ideal representation. In Waiting for Godot, the characters in a world that seems to have undergone some apocalyptic events. Human survival seems threatened somehow, but we don't know how. Characters are isolated in a wasteland with no apparent purpose to their lives. All of the characters alternately torment and console one another in the play with no apparent motivation to do either. In Waiting for Godot, the characters have discussions in which many unanswered and unanswerable questions are raised. And the characters struggle to maintain dignity and purpose in their world, because it's a world that seems to be disintegrating. And over everything, there's a clear doubt about the human capacity to control or understand anything in their universe. Yet, the play is somehow comic and clownish. And there is no action is really ever completed in Waiting for Godot, and in much absurd theater, and a term I use to describe that is abortive action. Many actions are started and none are completed, and this is, in my opinion, the way that theater of the absurd stays interesting, is watching those various plans fail. Now, on the more commercial end of things, and the more, I would say, mainstream end of things, a style of theater arose in the mid-20th century known as selective realism. And the non-realistic theater techniques that were established, this grew out of several of the non-realistic theater techniques that were developed by avant-garde theater artists between the 1880s and 1910s. But by the 1930s, a lot of these methods came to be used in mainstream theater, and that's where this form that some people describe as selective realism emerged. Selective realism is a term that describes styles of theater that blend both realistic and naturalistic theatrical techniques. But that's a mistake on the slide. Let's take a step back. Selective realism is a term that describes styles that blend both realistic and non-realistic theater techniques. I'll fix that in the slideshow. In fact, selective realism is one of the most common and popular modes of theatrical production. There's a blend of realistic language and non-realistic language in selective realism. For instance, as previously mentioned, Brecht's plays often separate long episodes of realistic dialogue between transitional songs or narrative storytelling. In selective realism, there's often a combination of realistic and non-realistic physical acting. So, for instance, in virtually every work of musical theater, acting alternates between natural movement and dancing. Selective realistic theater often combines realistic and non-realistic elements in theater design. Sets, such as the set that Joe Milziner designed for the premiere production of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, and that is here on this page, included realistic and non-realistic elements. So in this photo, you see realistic furnishings, but you also see non-realistic see-through walls through which the encroaching and overbearing towers of the nearby city is imposing on the little house that is the central location of the play. Another significant development in theatrical trends in the 20th century, and which has moved on into the present, is the rise of a greater number of playwrights from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds in professional theater. In particular, in the late 1960s, a new group of African American playwrights emerged. Some of the most famous of these are Lorraine Hansberry and Susan Laurie Parks. Intozaki Shange, whose For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, is a very influential piece. August Wilson, the author of not only Fences but of several major plays, is considered one of the greatest selective realist playwrights in American theater history. And another African-American playwright of significance right now is Lynn Nottage, whose play Ruined hit Broadway not too long ago, and she continues to have a very strong professional career in the United States. In addition, there has been an increase of diversity in Asian American playwrights and also in Latinx playwrights. Among Asian American playwrights, there is Sadakichi Hartman, who is somebody that I like to mention because he was a symbolist playwright in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he rarely gets mentioned anywhere, and he's a significant figure. David Henry Hwang, who's in Butterfly, is one of the most famous plays of the 1980s. Denise Uehara is another Asian American playwright. And then amongst the great Latinx playwrights, there's Maria Irene Fornes, Luis Miguel Valdez, whose Zoot Suit is a very famous piece, Chiara Alegria Hudes, Nilo Cruz, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, of course, whose Hamilton is incredibly well known amongst people. There's also been a greater number of playwrights from the LGBTQ community. Again, in the earlier 20th century, there was Gertrude Stein. Her play Dr. Faustus Lights the Lights is mentioned here, but she wrote many very interesting avant-garde plays. Tony Kushner, who is best known for Angels in America, which was, I would say, the first openly LGBTQ-themed play to be very successful on Broadway. Terrence McNally, whose Corpus Christi was one of the most controversial plays of the 1990s. Paula Vogel, who wrote How I Learned to Drive, and M.J. Kaufman, who wrote A Walrus and the Body of a Crocodile. So these are really just a few names, and these are primarily focusing on America. If you start looking outside of America, you also see a great number of playwrights appearing in post-colonial territories in the 20th century as countries developed their independence and break away from the governance of the European powers that have colonized them. So increase of diversity, I would say, is one of possibly the most important change in theater between the 20th century and the present.